Hi, I'm Justin.
And I'm Michael.
And this is our podcast where we discuss what we find interesting about the intersection of Web3 and digital security as we know it.
Between us, we have years of experience securing digital products and infrastructure, which has led us to be constantly curious about what's next.
Which is what this podcast is about, sharing our journey as we update our mental models for security in the next internet. Hello and welcome back to Not Your Crypto Podcast. Hello, Michael. How you doing?
Hello. I'm doing good. As I said before, I accidentally made us start recording again. We're full of Halloween candy over here.
Yeah, we're all hopped up on sugar.
Yeah.
It's the day after the night before in terms of Halloween. Kids went trick-or-treating and now we've got a house full of sugar, basically, and we're all trying to work our way through it frantically to make sure that we don't have it sticking around until Christmas. Yes?
Yeah.
It was an unseasonably warm October, though, or Halloween night, wasn't it?
It was very warm. It was out there in a sweater and regretted it. You know?
Should have been out there in flip-flops and a t-shirt, and well, then you wouldn't be in your costume. But yeah, it was definitely an unseasonably warm October here in Toronto as well. But yeah, so what are we here to talk about today?
Blockchains, right?
What a surprise. We're here today to talk about blockchains. We're talking about L1 blockchains, and specifically, this is almost a follow-on from our previous episode, which was all about regulation and how that affects different blockchains. Michael and I had a light bulb moment during that episode, or just after that episode, where we're like, okay, so there are so many what they are known as layer 1 blockchains. If you imagine, I guess the best Web 2 analogy is cloud service providers. L1s are just different cloud service providers. And there are a lot of them spinning up very quickly because obviously the effort to do so is smaller than spinning up an entire cloud service provider. But anyway, so lots of different L1s out there, but a lot of them are spun up for different reasons and have different use cases. Michael and I, being security engineers, are interested in the ones that are security adjacent. So by that, we mean which ones care about consistency, which ones care about privacy, which ones care about actual code security, which ones. So that kind of led us down a path where we went through a truncated list of L1s and just tried to see, well,
it's Wikipedia is what we did.
Yeah, it's Wikipedia, of course, which is why it's truncated, because it's not up to date. But hey, it's a case of which ones are security adjacent in their use case or in their objectives, and more importantly, technically, how do they technically differentiate from their competition in terms of meeting their security objectives? So that's kind of what we did, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, kind of bring our research back and talk about the new concepts we learned. Because the one thing I definitely learned during this research, I don't know about you, Michael, is that basically blockchain is cryptography, cryptography is blockchain. It's the entire game in terms of how these things run. And it would, even once you want to get a cursory understanding of how blockchains work, you'd say that's obvious, but it's also taken to a new level in terms of how they implement these new feature sets or these new security guardrails, etc., on top of a blockchain. So that has been the most fascinating part. And then there's some also more interesting insights I got from that, but I'll go into those later. Michael, yes. What do you think of this topic?
Yeah, I think when I kind of first came into being interested in the blockchain stuff, the crypto stuff, whatever, if you ask me, do I expect there to be many or few blockchains, right? I probably would have said few. My expectation would be that there's few, right? Network effects, the benefit of everybody being on the same one, do you really need more than one? All that kind of stuff would just make me say there's probably 2 or 3, Bitcoin,
100%. I agree with you.
Ethereum, maybe some new one, right?
Yeah, basically.
But that's not the way it is. There's lots, dozens that are probably relevant if you're interested. And so I think it's interesting to reflect on why is that different from my expectation, and I would think probably other people's expectation as well. Why is that, and what are these different blockchains trying to do, which is what you said, right? And yeah, I think you're right. Economically, you can think of it as there's a marketplace of blockchains out there, and they offer to the world, or to Web3, I guess, different feature sets and different combinations with different priorities. And then you, as a user of the chain or as a developer on the chain, as a consumer of the chain, kind of decide based on a lot of factors what one to use based on that. And there's this marketplace, right? There's I think one thing that is maybe one of the places where my expectation breaks from the reality is it's actually low barrier to entry to start a blockchain.
Yeah.
You kind of feel like it's a high barrier to entry because I don't know, just because you're not familiar with it probably.
Yeah.
But it's actually very low barrier to entry to start a blockchain, right?
Yeah.
You can fork something, lots of it is open.
Yeah.
And hey, you have a new one.
You and your forum buddies can basically set up
yeah.
as full nodes, and you're off to the races, basically. And
if you're cracked enough, I think that's what the kids say these days, right?
Cracked or based, I think. It is.
One of those. One of those two.
If you've been red pilled hard enough, look, I am not knee deep in the Twitters. I can't do the Twitter speak. But you know what's interesting, and you talking about that, is I did have the exact same impression coming into this as well. I was like, well, why would there be so many when they obviously hit their objectives and it's a sweet spot? But then what's come to me now while you're speaking is your phrase. I think you used it 4 or 5 pods ago, which is
whoa, deep cut.
Deep cut indeed. Basically, you've got these 3 objectives, which is obviously distributed, decentralized, and uncensorable. And then you have a spectrum in which where do you go on that spectrum? Which one do you prioritize more? And I think that's probably why we're starting to see, we have seen a plethora of blockchains come into existence, because they all occupy different spaces on that spectrum, which is actually interesting to see, because that basically means, again, going back to our first episode where you talk about political economy, it basically means that blockchains actually occupy a philosophical. They're very opinionated.
They're opinionated,
They have a philosophy about how this should be done, and each one of them is got an overarching. Yeah, basically they have a philosophy. They have an overarching strategy about how they're going to implement that, and then basically who wants that, whoever finds that philosophy is aligned with what they're trying to achieve with their user base or their program or their DApp or whatever, that's where they go build, and that's where they're drawn to. And that's what I think we're seeing when we pull up a list of layer 1 blockchains. And what I mean by the way, when we mean L1 blockchains, we mean layer 1s, i.e. fundamental. There's layer 2s, there's rollups, there's sidechains, there's all these basically different implementations, these different solutions on top of a blockchain to solve a specific problem that people didn't anticipate when that blockchain went live. So we're talking
which
about
is kind of interesting, right? If you're a developer or a consumer, whatever, in this world, and you have a problem, then you have a choice about how you build to solve that problem, and you can choose to build on top of, or you can choose to build beside, or you can choose to build foundationally, right?
Yes, you can.
So there's lots of layer 2 blockchains that try to solve the same problem on top of another blockchain that some L1 chain is trying to solve.
Yeah, exactly. So it's still very Wild West. It's still very early days in terms of development and being able to find, okay, so who does what for what, and is that the best at doing that thing? You're basically kind of just going through, and after a while, it's kind of like trying to choose a program language. It's like this Swiss Army knife of programming.
Yeah, like a framework.
Which framework do you want to use is just literally dependent on what you're trying to do and which one you care about the most, which one you can be bothered to learn and which one. So it's actually been quite interesting in going through the list. But yeah, I think that was probably the most insight I had, was basically a lot of these are somewhere on a spectrum of what they're trying to achieve with the whole decentralization, lack of censorship, and distributed, and where they want to be and how far they want to be in that 3-dimensional spectrum. But yeah, so moving on to what we've done today. So yes, basically what Michael and I then did as security engineers is we decided to zone in on the ones that are security adjacent. And so we came up with about 3.5. You'll understand why I say a half later once we get through the list. So this podcast is basically a listicle of the ones that we think are the most adjacent to, have objectives that are security adjacent, i.e. privacy, consistency, and basically on censorship. That's kind of where we got through these. And this was interesting because it took us basically had to go through the catacombs, because there were some very old blockchains that I didn't do. I mean, our first one that came to mind that I came across, I didn't even know existed. I remember hearing about it at the time. and then not really paying much attention to it going forward. And this was back in 2013, because then there was a couple of blockchains that spun up. So basically, the first L1 that I came across, which was the whole purpose of it, was to create a place for censorship resistant top level domains. And you'll understand why in 2013 this was important when we give you some context, is Namecoin. So long story short, this blockchain allows people to register DNS names on the blockchain, and therefore they're uncensorable because it's decentralized. So anyone can do the lookup against an RPC node that then looks up on the chain. No one can stop you accessing that website or that whatever's hosted at that domain name on that IP address, because there is no centralized DNS. There's no centralized TLS, top level domain registrar to block you. 2013, if you remember, was it the height? I would say yes. It was the height of the piracy wars.
Take me back to 2013.
I will take you back to 2013, because these were interesting times. This was the height of the piracy wars. This was when I think, well, obviously we've now gone past Napster, and we're now into the file sharing, which is, if you want to go back, there was, okay, now I'm really gonna have to jog my memory. There was LimeWire. There was another one that I cannot remember. But anyway, so if we go back to the LimeWire years, where people were pirating movies and pirating music and all of those things. There was then obviously the most famous example, Pirate Bay, which came out of Sweden. And basically music companies and movie companies were not very happy. So what happened was you then had agencies in America who would then seize top-level domain names. Because if you were hosting a blogging website or something like that, they would say that's piracy because you uploaded this music and you were sharing it without licensing rights from the music companies and the movie companies. Music got done first, but then once bandwidth became a non-discussion because people started to get fiber, movies were next, and the movie industry was not about to get played like that. So they basically started seizing top-level domain names. So this became an actual need. And so somebody looked at the blockchain. Bitcoin had been released 2010 by then. 3 years later, and said, how about we come up with a decentralized way to register top-level domain names so that they can never be seized by a government again? And we have Namecoin. Michael, that's my brief synopsis of that. Do you remember any of that?
There you go.
What do you think? And does it make sense?
Yeah. No, I certainly like the kind of DRM wars, right?
Yeah.
The early, well, not even the first phase of it, but like
no, it's
probably
like
the second or third even.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that happened around like in 2013, if I remember right, was that was Snowden, right? Like
yes.
Snowden,
yes, it was. Snowden leaked.
Oh my
gosh, now you've sent me back into the wormhole. Do you
like
remember that day?
Mid 2013 or something like that.
Yeah, it was.
And kicked a bunch of this kind of thing into a higher gear as well.
Yes, he did.
But yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think like I don't know about you, but like when I was looking into the Namecoin stuff, I was like, this feels like it's from that time.
Yes.
You know, like the things that it cares about doing.
Yeah.
Feels like it's in that mindset where like it cares about giving the internet a technical solution to a censorship threat or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like, you know, like what you get is a domain name stored in the blockchain on this specific TLD, right? It's like a .bit, I think, TLD.
Yeah, .bit, yeah.
And then it resolves to the blockchain and all that. From like a user's perspective, this is not like a trivial thing to use necessarily. I mean, again, at the time, people interfacing with the system are definitely able to do that.
Yeah,
but
they're power users. They'd be classed as at the very least.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of other things, like difficult to access, right? Similar to like an onion domain sort of thing.
Yeah, it's an onion domain. Yeah, similar thing.
You need to do some special stuff to be able to access it, right? Other than that, though, it's like kind of technically simple, I think.
Yeah, it's just key value pairs.
It's basically just storing data in a blockchain, and in the chain, and the data that's stored is a association between a domain and is it an IP address? I don't know. Do you know that?
I think it's an IP. We can check, but I think
like do you store a direct IP address in the?
Yes. On the that's a good question. No, it's registered. I mean,
I don't know.
no,
I shouldn't
I can't
ask
remember.
questions we don't know in the
Yeah,
middle of the pod.
exactly.
I should stop doing that. But then the other thing you noted, I think, about the chain, which I thought was interesting, was this mechanism around purchasing domains and kind of the pre-purchasing. I forget what the word they use is. Do you want to like explain that a little bit?
So effectively, the way blockchains work is transactions are announced to the network. I mean, we kind of saw this thing with the Mev Boost podcast that we did a couple of podcasts ago. They're announced to the network. So if you're watching the network, you can see something technically before it happens, because it will go into a mempool that then goes, once consensus is arrived, then it is added to the blockchain for everyone to see. So when it's in that mempool state, you can see it. So if I go to buy a domain name, that transaction gets announced to a set of nodes. And if I'm watching it, I could then technically front run that that transaction. And in this case, Michael has a cool domain name. I then front run it and register it before it happens. So they implemented a delay mechanism to make sure that doesn't happen. So what they do is it's not broadcasted during the registration step, only a salted hash of it is. And then there's a delay of 12 blocks before you can actually, I'm just reading this obviously, before you can broadcast your name with the registration steps.
You're reading the FAQ right now as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then by the time the name is registered, by the time it's broadcast to the network, the name is already registered. That's kind of what they had to do, which is interesting because that is it's funny going back to the Mev Boost thing and learning about the front running of transactions. We were like, oh, I think Michael, you even said this is a fundamental feature. This isn't a bug. This is a feature of all blockchains. And so as we start to research other blockchains, you start to see that some of them have obviously anticipated this or have been burnt by it themselves. And they've all come up with their own solutions in terms of how do you stop this front running? How do you undermine this front running mechanism that people are able to exploit?
Yeah. Or enable it, right? Depending on what you want to do.
Or enable it and use the market way of letting it come out in the wash. What was interesting about Namecoin is, yes, it felt so much of the time, but it still has updates in 2024. It's still got.
I think it's slowed down, certainly, but it's still there. You can still grab yourself a .bit domain.
Maybe we should.
But yeah, I thought that. So you talked about the way these things come down to cryptography, usually at the end of the day, like new features. I think there's some blockchains where features are like more on the agent side, which is kind of interesting, like differentiating features, I guess. But anyway, in this case, like, this like, hey, so drawing that connection between, attacks that happen in the mempool, right? Mev attacks, loosely kind of defined or whatever, like the MevBoost stuff we talked about, but this like front running domain purchases, one that is something that can and does happen in Web 2, right? Which is interesting.
Is it? I didn't know that.
Well, I don't know. Well, I don't know, but like it probably looks a little bit different. People do definitely complain that they like search for a domain and then it gets bought.
Okay.
Before, you know what I mean, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, basically, like the conceptual framework of it is there's like information disclosure about an action I want to take prior to me taking that action. Yeah. Right. And then somebody who is able to observe that info disclosure can then like extract value from me because they know I want to take that action. Right. Yeah. And so this is a very I don't know. This like pre-registration thing with the hash, like it's very textbook crypto kind of solution to this problem, right? I don't commit to disclosing the info. I commit to disclosing a hash of the info, and then later I can prove that you know this is what I wanted to do because I committed to it. Yes. It's good stuff. It's like very like brain satisfying.
It is very brain satisfying in its elegance and as a solution. And that's something else that I was thinking. I was just like, a lot of these solutions are very elegant. And the insight I then had was, okay, so anyway, we'll get to this later. But long story short, as security engineers, we're constantly running the constant tensions when you're in a large enterprise trying to basically secure, maintain a risk posture of sorts. privacy comes up a lot, and how do you allow different things to access different sets of data without actually revealing too much? And I'm like, oh, cryptography kind of had this solved the entire time. That's kind of like, and I've seen a lot of bespoke solutions, a lot of interesting solutions being built on the fly in various enterprises to try and solve these problems. And then I'm just like, okay, so these, and then when you realize some of these cryptographic solutions were suggested in papers in like 2001, you're like, oh, so I should have just been going to crypto conferences instead of security conferences this entire time. But that's a story for another day. That's just me getting on my soapbox. But yeah, this one did give me very 2030. Because you know what else is funny? At that time, it's when we had, because obviously Web2 platforms had been established for a minute by that point. But then also people started to extrapolate to where this was going. So I remember around that period of time as well. I remember there was, I'm a gamer, so I was playing, was it Nintendo DS? And there was a big hoopla around them basically doing extra level DRM. Let's put it like that. As the best, most articulated. Okay? It was no longer a general purpose computing device. It was basically locked down to only run certain binaries. And cyberpunks were not happy, and people were like, this is the way computing is going. People were starting to understand that people were building walled gardens, and these walled gardens were not allowing for interoperability, and more importantly, you can't run what you want to run and what is supposed to be a genuine general purpose computing device. If I build it, I should be able to run it on my machine. I don't need a centralized authority to tell me what I can and can't run on something I've paid hard-earned cash for. And so this is what this again, this thing, like, this is what Namecoin kind of gives me a flashback to. It's like people started to see this coming. We're now already in it. We're now living in that universe. Like we're done.
Yeah.
The game is game set and match. But at the same time, people started to predict it, and so they started to build tooling around it. And as you said, like Snowden, etc., all of that fed into this. Oh, we've kind of allowed large companies that were once small companies but have been supercharged by VC money to capture large swathes of what was supposed to be a digital paradise. Human nature once again. So yeah, so that's Namecoin, everyone. The next one on the list is Algorand. Michael, do you want to give us a brief overview of what this one does and why we put it on the list?
Yeah, sure. I'll attempt to. So Algorand, again, an L1 blockchain. And I don't know, when I was reading into it, felt to me like it had a particular focus on enabling like DeFi use cases on top of it, right?
Same.
And if we think about the progression of blockchain, different chains, like, Bitcoin doesn't really enable too much just on its own, right? It's basically a record of like transactions.
Yeah.
Ethereum, I don't know that it, I mean, I don't know. I'm going to be speaking about things I don't know, I guess. But like, don't know that it kind of conceived of the level of DeFi support and interest that it would have, and that it would kind of end up enabling, because it's basically like a general purpose, general purpose like compute on the chain, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, this seemed like more targeted at, okay, like there's, what people are interested in doing with blockchains, it turns out, is largely DeFi.
Yeah.
So let's kind of see if we can enable that more fundamentally in the L1.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think like it has a couple of key differentiators that it kind of tries to like position itself with in this market of chains. One is about like, one is kind of basically around the consensus mechanism, right? Yeah. It kind of does some modifications, kind of contrasting itself with like regular proof of stake consensus, to have its own kind of take on doing a proof of stake consensus that is supposed to deal with problems it sees in a regular proof of stake thing. And I think the problem, like the kind of philosophical, again, to go that direction, problem that it sees with the pure proof of stake, not pure, typical, I guess, proof of stake consensus is like, and it's a criticism I think that has been around like POS systems for a while, is they tend towards like concentration.
Yes, they do.
In a way that feels bad to people who like decentralization, right? Like proof of stake is basically, okay, like instead of like you're trying to like race to find this solution to this puzzle using compute, and then once you have the solution, you're the one who's like proposing the block or whatever. You kind of get selected based on how much of the token in the chain you like hold. And so like it's kind of like if you hold more token, correct me if I'm like wrong on this, if you hold more token, there's kind of more chance that you're going to be participating in the consensus.
Yes.
And by participating in the consensus, you also get rewarded.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of progression towards like concentrating the consensus mechanism in a few bigger players and a few bigger pools of tokens.
Yeah.
And people don't like that because like kind of the fundamental trust model of these systems is that like it's distributed, right? Like,
yes.
If things get too concentrated, then you kind of break the assumption that things are secure because they're distributed, more or less.
Basically, that is basically the perfect. And so this is what they try to do, which is they were like, okay, so how about we come up with a whole new concept called pure proof of stake, where we randomize all the things. So effectively, the block proposer is randomized. Again, if you go back to our Mev Boost podcast, you'll be familiar with some of these terms. But basically, a block proposer is someone who's saying this transaction needs to be processed for consensus and then added to the chain. So the proposer of a new transaction is basically randomized. The validator committee, so basically there's a whole committee that say, okay, we're going to work on this consensus. We're going to arrive at consensus against this transaction and then do whatever cryptography needs to do and add it to the block. And all of that is randomized. And basically also another thing that it does is the stake that the amount of tokens or the asset that you decide to stake stays with the user. It doesn't go into a validator per se. It stays within their wallet as opposed to going into one of these pools. So it does a bunch of different things to what most proof of stake networks do today. And it's very obvious that, to me, the reason it goes to these lengths is for consistency. They have definitely prioritized consistency because in decentralized finance, and even standard finance, consistency is the name of the game. So Algorand kind of came up with these features. They pure proof of stake, cryptographic sortition, where basically they verify exactly what has happened before anyone else, or before it is published to the actual blockchain. And it's quite clever in what they do. They've also got quantum resistancy in there. So obviously they've basically got cryptographic integrity even when quantum computers come online. They won't be able to hack their blockchain and be able to start reading all of the secrets on the blockchain because they've implemented an algorithm that has been proven to be quantum resistant and selected by NIST to go forward, I think, in the next round, because they do a series of rounds of selections. So yeah, everything is pointing towards consistency and integrity of the actual data, not so much speed and decentralization. That's kind of that's where they've ended up on that 3D spectrum again. I imagine it's not even 3D, it's basically 2D, like a triangle. And you basically have one point, and then you have a centralized point that moves around. Do you see what I'm saying?
It's like those graphs where you like those like RPG stat graphs where you have more here, more here, more here. Yeah,
that's exactly what I'm seeing. And except it's a 3-pointed one, this one, and that's exactly what I'm saying. So yeah, that's kind of what I got from Algorand. This one came out of the ICO craze, which is interesting. So I don't know if you remember the ICO craze 2016, 2017.
Who could forget?
Oh, mate, times were wild. And people raised stupid money. And then they actually went live. They deployed their mainnet, and they're still going today. I think there's a lot of financial institutions, well, not a lot, but financial institutions are taking a look at this, and it's just steadily trucking away. I find consistency does have an adjacent relation to security in some respects because, well, quite frankly, you need the security to keep things consistent. It's not actually that hard an equation to figure out.
I think it's like depending on the kind of use case that you're targeting for the thing as well. It's like a kind of a compromise inconsistency opens up space for there to be different kinds of threats, right?
Yes.
Which is one way of looking at some of the Mev Boost-ish stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
yeah, definitely. And so that was why this one kind of grabbed my attention. They did some interesting things with their cryptography using verifiable random functions. You can go and take a look at that as well.
Yeah, I didn't honestly
Online.
did not quite follow it all.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to get reading into, but there's so many different things they're using. But then when you start going digging into those things, you're like, oh, these are actually old ideas that have just been implemented in a current different context, which is what I do love about it. It's the big brain thinking of, okay, this was invented for this one problem over here, and then I'm doing this thing here, but oh, it turns out this solves this. If I just tweak it slightly, I can actually get to. And I really like elegant solutions like that, where it's like, oh wow, I just didn't see that. Yeah. So the final L1 that I'm interested in also has the worst reputation because it has a complete and utter devotion to privacy, and it's Monero. Monero, also aka known as the money launderer's blockchain, basically, but it uses a bunch of very interesting technical solutions to ensure, basically, it is a currency. It's not a programmable blockchain like you would with an EVM such as Algorand. It's very much similar to Namecoin in that, and Bitcoin in that it does one thing. It's there to transfer assets from one user to another. Blockchains, by definition, are public, and this tries to turn it on its head by making sure it is public in terms of how it functions, but in terms of the data it hosts, it's not public. So sender, receiver, transaction amounts are all obfuscated. And you're like, how can that be possible? Well, through some very clever cryptographic techniques. First of all, they obfuscate the sender ID by using a technique called ring signatures. Ring signatures is a cryptographic solution that was actually invented by the same people that invented RSA. It was almost like one of their offshoot ideas back in 2001, where they were like, if you want to validate that something has been sent by a group of people, then you can use a concept of ring signatures, but you don't want to identify an individual in that group because you want to maintain their privacy. So something valid has been sent because they were supposed to send something, or a message, or transmit a message, or whatever, but it's by a group. You want to validate it's come from the group, but don't want to identify an individual. You have a ring signature. So they implemented that. Then how do you actually obfuscate the actual transaction amounts themselves? Well, they use something called ring confidential transactions and zero knowledge proofs. I don't think we've talked about zero knowledge proofs on this podcast, partially because we struggle to understand them. But long story short, it's a way of validating a piece of data without actually revealing the data itself. Is the most ham-fisted explanation I can come up with. It's not for a lack of trying, by the way. Trust me, it's not for a lack of trying. Michael and I have spent many hours trying to understand in detail how ZK proofs work.
We'll get there.
And then recipients, as in how do you protect the identity of the person who is receiving the cash, are protected by stealth addresses. Long story short, stealth addresses is another technique they use whereby, they basically obfuscate the actual address, and they have the wallet then scan for transactions on the blockchain. They then scan for a piece of data that only that wallet can unlock. Long story, it's a dance between private keys and public keys. When you create a wallet normally on a blockchain, your wallet is a public-private key pair. In Monero, when you create a wallet, they create you two sets of public-private keys. One for viewing, one for spending. And so basically, when you want to receive some money, if I want to send Michael money and on Monero, I basically take his spend public key and use that to encrypt the actual transaction. His address, and then send the transaction to there. And then his wallet will scan for that particular encrypted key with his corresponding private key from his spend account, and then decrypt it and then be able to see. And then another thing that the next level they went to is obscuring IP addresses, because when you're online, you have an IP address. End of story. All this operates over IP, over the IP stack. So they wanted to obscure IP addresses as well, and they implemented basically an application layer protocol called Dandelion++, which almost in some ways sounds similar to Onion and Tor /Tor, but long story short, they obfuscate the IP address using some very clever trickery, technical wizardry, where the way Monero works, when you go to announce a transaction to the network, it normally floods the entire network. So it'll go down all the paths and it'll announce the transaction. However, what happens is if you're an observer of the entire network, it almost passes like a wave. And so you can start to do some math and start to originate or pinpoint where the wave started. So we were like, well, that's not great for privacy, because then you could basically tie it down to an RPC node and eventually to an IP address that pinged transaction to the RPC node. So what they then did is they've basically introduced a bunch of hops before the network gets flooded with that transaction. So you don't know where it originated from if you were an observer of that entire network. So I think it's kind of obvious who their adversary is in that instance, in that threat model, because who has the resources to monitor an entire blockchain network? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. This was fascinating. I mean, I have probably botched a couple of the explanations here, but there is some really cool cryptography going on here. But at the same time, again, it's not liked because of that exact reason, because, well, quite frankly, authorities can't see who's doing what, where, and when. Michael, what did you think of this one? Did you get a chance to glance over this one?
I did. Yeah, not as much as you, because this is why I just let you roll on that. But I think there were two things that stood out to me that were like interesting here. One is the whole what is like, again, that kind of brain like satisfaction with the ring signature thing.
Yeah.
Like, again, ring signatures, one of those things that if you ask me, like, is it possible to do this? I would have said no.
No.
You know, like basically basically a ring signature means that if I have my public private key, I have a message, and then I have a bunch of other public keys, like only the other public keys, I can sign my message in such a way that you can't tell which public key signed it, but you can still verify that it was signed by one of them.
Yeah.
Feels like one of those things that like shouldn't be possible, but is.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, just fascinated with that, because like PKI, like public key crypto stuff, is just full of those sorts of things where you're like, that shouldn't be possible. You know, and that is like you know, like I get that same feeling from like key exchange, like, you know, like Diffie-Hellman key exchange.
Yeah.
Feels like it shouldn't be possible to both agree on a key without actually sending the key.
Yeah.
But it is, right? Or, you know, like even like blockchain stuff itself, like the kind of foundational, like you know, factoring problems at the core of it that are, you know, hard to compute, easy to solve, like that kind of stuff. So yeah, the ring signature thing I thought was neat.
Yes, same here. That was my favorite one of all of these.
And then the other thing that, like, you know, stood out to me was at the beginning of the episode, you talked about how features are usually cryptography, right? And here, like, okay, let's see. Whether if you have a blockchain and you have a threat that you're trying to design the blockchain against, whether cryptography is the solution or not depends on whether, like, solving that problem through a cryptographic feature is the solution or not, depends on what your threat is and kind of how holistically you're looking at the problem, right? Because, like, you know, Monero, again, it's like its whole thing is this like very stringent commitment to privacy, to like not disclosing data about transactions, basically, to an observer of the network, right? Not, and that's important. It's not to an observer of the chain, right? It's to an observer of the network, because the chain isn't just like a platonic abstract set of blocks. The chain is that, but then it's also a bunch of agents and nodes that are interacting with it. And they're interacting with it over a plain old network, right? And so, you know, they have this problem about like traceability of transactions through network chatter, basically. And through even like, not even just like this IP address did something, but this like statistical look at network chatter and saying, like, you know, if we observe enough traffic over enough time and we apply some patterns to it, we can tell that this did this with this likelihood. And even that, they're like, oh, that's too much. You know, we need to design against that. And the solution to that isn't a cryptographic feature in that chain, that like abstract chain. The solution to that is network level, more or less. It's probably practically it's a combination, but like it's network level. And so like what I found interesting about that is, it cares about the problem holistically. It doesn't care about a blockchain even necessarily. It cares about this holistic problem of like total privacy and transferring value.
And oh, mate, you've just hit on something. I think that's where a lot of these blockchains are almost missing a trick. In fact, no, I think the creams rise to the top on that one. A blockchain, the fact that a solution is using a blockchain to support its technical implementation should be irrelevant, right? It so happens that a problem needs a distributed ledger needs distributed ledger technology to support it. Fine, but that shouldn't be the USP of the thing. The thing is, we're trying to solve this problem. That's the forefront. And that's what Monero is a great example of. It's how do you transact with complete and utter privacy online with strangers you've never met before? And we need it to be effective. It's a trustless transaction. And that's what they did. That's the entirety of their approach. And again, you see that with Ethereum as well. So that's the reason why Monero's really old and is still, I'm assuming, very heavily used. Authorities still hate it. But you're right. It's a holistic approach to solving a problem that has taken. This is the technology we're going to use for this reason. But we're also going to it's not just about the chain. You're 100%. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. And I think, like, honestly, like, you could contrast that to what we talked about earlier a little bit with, like, Namecoin, not necessarily to critique it or whatever, but to say, like, what it cares about is, like, censorship of DNS names, and it does that by putting DNS records in this ledger, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't deal with the network part, right? No. And, like, holistically, if your problem is, like, somebody censoring the availability of your server to the internet, like, you also care about the network part.
Yes, you do.
Because, you know, your domain name could be up there and not seized, but your server could be seized. Or your ISP could take your IP, like, you know, take your IP address down or whatever that you're announcing things on.
Yeah.
And so there are two parts to that problem too, and Namecoin is addressing one part of the problem but not another, and that's fine. It could be the design constraint, and, you know, there's lots of other variously sketchy ways to deal with the network part, to look at the network part, right? Of that. But yeah, it's kind of, like, interesting to compare that. Like, Monero really is trying to do it all, trying to do the whole holistic problem solve. Namecoin is solving a part of that problem in its own space and leaving a part of it, and those are different, like, design choices that the chains make, and it means that how you as a person or whatever interfaces with them is going to be different.
100%. And so that was quite interesting. I did enjoy researching that one. And then the other 0.5 is, so as we've talked about reentrancy attacks, we talked about, we did a OWASP top 10 of
two-part
blockchain vulnerabilities. Yeah, we did. Was it a 2-part or a 1-part? I can't remember.
Whoops.
I can't remember. I think it was a 1-part. A one self-contained episode. Anyway, a lot of those vulnerabilities were code level smart contract vulnerabilities. So now there's third generation of blockchains who've basically taken the approach of, we're going to look at the actual language we're using, kind of like when Google redid Rust to replace C++ and all of that. They've basically taken that approach to, okay, Solidity is cool, but when it's of its time, and it basically unwittingly implemented all of these types of vulnerabilities, or made them possible or easier to access anyway.
Insecure defaults, by and large, right? Like,
long story short,
that's kind of the cycle of things. Like, we have this new technology, it has insecure defaults. We all start using it. Whoops. and then, like, you know, Gen 2 of the technology is trying to build in to the framework itself or to the platform itself, like, memory 100%. Safety or whatever, right?
Exactly. And so now we have a language called Move, which ironically came out of Facebook, one of these Web 2 platforms. And so we have a couple of blockchains built on that, one called Sui, the other one called Aptos. And they basically looked at the code, like the language in which they actually code in, and have built in a bunch of safe defaults as well. And they're known as Move-based blockchains. And they seem to be gathering quite ahead of steam as well in terms of ease of use for developers, of course, because they've got some very big brains who were literally in the Facebook blockchain project back in the day, the one that all the governments around the world clubbed together to stop. Can you imagine being a company that powerful that all the governments need to come together to stop you? And it's a decentralized technology. So that's the 0.5. But the reason it's only 0.5 is because they basically take a look at it from the code level, and only the code level. Obviously, they've implemented security mechanisms within their chains, but I don't think they'll be vastly different from the ones we've seen from, for example, a Solana, et cetera, which is why we haven't really covered them in depth.
like over time attacks move up the stack. Like in a tech stack, over time attacks move from the bottom of the stack upwards because the way we secure it tends to also be from the bottom and then up, right? So like, like from like Web 2 stuff, like or even just like general internet stuff, like they move from, like OS level attacks to like network level attacks to like application level attacks, like web app level attacks, like XSS and CSRF and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then to like basically human level attacks.
Yeah.
With phishing and whatever else, like, social engine, all that kind of stuff, right? So
exactly.
Like, over time stuff moves up, and I think the same progression is happening right now in Web 3 broadly, or in distributed applications and all that, right? Like they're
100%.
kind of ratcheting upwards in the stack.
100%. Okay, so I think that's kind of the pod. But yeah, what about you, Michael? Any thoughts or final conclusion thoughts?
No, not really. Like, I don't know, cop out to say no, probably. I think like I was pretty interested in how specific some blockchains are and how general purpose other ones are, and like how those ones are designed and developed differently. I thought that was interesting, and like, coming to a new chain or to a new, like, learning about this, having the mindset of, okay, like, what problem is this trying to solve? Like, what is this trying to be? And how is it designed to achieve that, sort of, you know what I mean?
Yeah, got you. 100%. Yeah, this was a fascinating trip. Okay, well, I think that wraps us up. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new pod. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and catch you on the next go round.